a twisted plot of racism and irony. When hate blinds justice, the tables can turn in the most shocking way. The tragic incident began with deep-seated prejudice, and a culture of unchecked power meant many communities. The combination of racism and the authority of law enforcement can prove deadly. For years, the department turned a blind eye to Officer Miller's record, and accumulation of complaints and disciplinary actions swept under the rug. Miller, a man emboldened by a system that rarely held him accountable, operated with a sense of impunity. He believed himself above reproach, his actions immune from scrutiny. This mindset was not born overnight. It was nurtured by years of complicity in a culture that tolerated misconduct, particularly when the victims were black. On this night, Miller's victim was a black man he wrongly assumed to be powerless, just another target of his routine aggression. Miller's deep prejudice did not require justification. It was instinctive, embedded in his worldview. He saw a black man as an object of his disdain, not as an individual with dignity or rights. There was no specific provocation. The man did not pose a threat or commit a crime. His skin color alone in Miller's eyes was enough. Miller's decision to tie the man to the train tracks was not just an act of violence. It was a statement. It was an attempt to erase this man's humanity, to strip him of the basic protections that the law is supposed to guarantee to everyone. It was a chilling example of how racism turns even the most mundane encounters into life and death situations. Here Miller was judge, jury, and executioner, confident that no one would stop him. This scenario is not unique to one town or one department. It reflects the broader reality that systemic racism still infects parts of law enforcement, feeding into a cycle of abuse and silence. It exposes how some officers view their role not as protectors, but as enforcers of racial hierarchies. When unchecked power meets racial hatred, the consequences can be catastrophic. The scene set by this power dynamic underscores the fragility of black lives in the face of white supremacy within the system. It reminds us that until every institution of power is held to account, incidents like this can and will happen. Miller's actions that night were not a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. They were deliberate, born of a system that had taught him. He could do what he wanted without fear of consequences. This environment of racial bias and institutional failure laid the groundwork for the horrific events that followed. The revelation that Officer Miller's victim was actually the new police chief forced a moment of reckoning. It exposed the thin veil that often separates a false sense of superiority from the cold reality of accountability. In that instant, Miller's entire worldview was turned upside down. The man he had dehumanized, assumed to be powerless, held the very authority that Miller had spent his career abusing. This realization was not just personal, it carried a powerful institutional weight. It exposed the lie at the heart of Miller's beliefs that race determined worth, that black men were objects of scorn and suspicion, rather than leaders and protectors. It was an abrupt, undeniable truth that the man he thought was a nobody was in fact the highest-ranking officer in the department. It forced a confrontation with the prejudice that Miller had always seen as invisible and inconsequential. The message revealing the man's identity as simple photograph or a text was more than just information. It was a direct challenge to the entire culture of the department that had allowed men like Miller to flourish. It was an admission, however, that even within the halls of power, black excellence could no longer be ignored or erased. And for Miller, it was the ultimate irony. The very man he sought to silence and destroy was his new superior. This revelation shattered the complacency that had shielded Miller from the consequences of his actions. It turned his hateful act from a private exercise in cruelty to a public scandal with irreversible consequences. It also underscored the hypocrisy of a system that claimed to protect and serve, but allowed men like Miller to operate with impunity until their victim was someone who could not be dismissed. For the broader institution, this revelation forced a moment of truth. It exposed how assumptions and prejudices can become deadly when left unchecked. It was a reminder that racism is not just about personal bias. It is about the structures and systems that support that bias and allow it to flourish in the shadows. The shock of the revelation served as a wake-up call, not just for Miller but for everyone complicit in the culture that enabled him. It was a harsh lesson that no one, no matter how secure in their prejudice, can escape the consequences of their hate when the truth comes to light. In that moment, Miller's world collapsed, and with it, the illusion that racism could remain hidden forever was finally broken. Asterisk, in the aftermath of the revelation, the entire department was forced to confront its own failings. The footage from Miller's dash cam, once thought of as a silent witness, became the undeniable evidence of his cruelty and of the department's neglect. What had once been whispered about racism, abuse of power, the silencing of black voices, was now laid bare for all to see. There was no room left for excuses or denial. Miller's actions, so brazen and so hateful, could no longer be ignored or spun away by internal politics. The community, already weary of empty promises and unkempt reforms, demanded accountability. The image of the new police chief, nearly murdered by one of his own, became a rallying cry for justice and change. It was a reminder that hate, left unchecked, threatens not just individuals but the very institutions meant to protect them. For the new police chief, this was not just about survival, was about using his near-death experience as a catalyst for real reform. He stood as living proof of the system's capacity for both cruelty and change. He took the horror of that night and transformed it into a demand for sweeping accountability within the department, the town, in every place where racism and power intersect. Miller faced the full weight of the law he had once twisted to suit. His own prejudice, his badge, once a symbol of unchecked power, became evidence of his betrayal of the oath he swore to uphold. But more than punishing one man, this moment forced everyone to ask how many others had suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to serve and protect. How many voices had been ignored because they didn't hold the same title as the new police chief? This is the heart of the story, a story that challenges us to reckon with the reality of systemic racism and to confront the question, if it took nearly killing the new police chief to spark real accountability, what does that say about the value we place on Black lives every other day? I don't let this be just another tragic story. Demand transparency. Demand reform. Demand that every Black life is treated with the dignity and respect it deserves, whether or not it wears a badge.